Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. Usually when we approach a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, mechanical precision.
Right.
Like if a patient comes in with a fractured femur, the radiograph shows a jagged white line, the surgeon points to it, and the pathology is just right there. It's binary, yes. Broken or not broken.
Exactly. We naturally gravitate toward things we can actually see and quantify. It makes the intervention straightforward.
But when you step into the world of psychiatric disease and substance use, that visibility completely vanishes.
It really does.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape driven by, invisible neurotransmitter shifts, receptor downregulations, and all these neurochemical adaptations. So today we're taking a deep dive into translating one of the most critical texts in perioperative medicine.
Yes.
We're looking at Chapter 29 from Stolting's Anesthesia and Coexisting Disease, focusing on psychiatric disease, substance use disorders, and drug overdoses.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And our mission today is really for you, the students stepping into the operating room for the first time. Mm-hmm. Because understanding how a patient's pre-existing neurochemistry fundamentally alters their physiological response to anesthesia, it isn't just academic. It's literally a matter of life and death.
Yeah, the clinical reality is that you are never, ever just anesthetizing a generic baseline human system.
Right.
The framework we have to use here, the logical chain, is pretty clear. The pathophysiology of a mood disorder or a substance dependence creates a very specific perioperative risk.
Okay.
And you have to trace how that underlying disease state forces you to evaluate and optimize the patient beforehand, and finally, how that dictates your intraoperative and postoperative management choices once they're asleep on the table.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the most common psychiatric conditions presenting in the OR, which are mood disorders.
Yeah, major depression affects roughly 6 to 7% of the population at any given time.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And the clinical diagnosis requires persistent symptoms, so things from the chapter's tables like anhedonia, insomnia, profound fatigue. But the underlying mechanism we care about as anesthetists usually circles back to the monoamine neurotransmitter hypothesis.
Meaning a relative deficiency of norepinephrine and serotonin at the synapses, right?
Exactly. And the therapeutic response to that deficiency is to artificially increase those synaptic concentrations.
So medications.
Right. Patients will typically present on SSRIs, SNRIs, or occasionally the older monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the MAOIs.
Now wait, so if I'm prepping a patient on an MAOI, the old rule was to stop at 14 days before surgery. Is that still true?
No, actually, we've totally abandoned that rule.
Really?
Yeah.
Because is mixing an MAOI with the painkiller meperidine like putting diesel in a standard gas engine?
That's a great way to put it, and the answer is yes, that specific mix is a disaster. But we don't stop the MAOIs anymore because the risk of profound psychiatric relapse or suicidal ideation far outweighs the anesthetic risk.
Okay, that makes sense.
As long as you understand the receptor mechanics, you can safely anesthetize them. But your margin for error with specific drugs drops to zero. Like you mentioned, you absolutely cannot administer meperidine.
Because meperidine isn't just an opioid, right? It actively inhibits serotonin reuptake.
Exactly. So if the patient's MAOI is already preventing the breakdown of serotonin, and then you push meperidine, you are essentially pouring gasoline onto a fire that has no exhaust valve.
Oh, wow. So the synapse just floods.
It floods, and you trigger serotonin syndrome, and the clinical presentation maps directly to that synaptic flooding.
What did that look like in the patient?
Well, it starts with mild symptoms. Akathisia, which is the severe restlessness and tremor. But as those receptors become overwhelmed, the central nervous system loses its inhibitory control.
Which means the motor neurons go crazy.
Right. You'll see inducible clonus, where a simple reflex test triggers these sustained muscle spasms. And if it's unmanaged, it rapidly deteriorates into massive muscular hypertonicity and lethal hyperthermia.
And since ketamine is, a profound sympathetic stimulant that prevents the reuptake of catecholamines, I'd imagine that's also strictly off the table for the MAOI patient.
100%. Ketamine will provoke an exaggerated, potentially uncontrollable hypertensive crisis in these patients. You must use alternative induction agents.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to another intervention for severe depression. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT.
Yeah.
ECT essentially induces a grand mal seizure. And physiologically, a seizure triggers an initial brief parasympathetic response, followed immediately by a massive sympathetic storm.
A massive storm. The hemodynamics are violent. The heart rate and blood pressure just skyrocket.
So how do we manage that?
Well, our management revolves around blunting that storm while keeping the patient safe. We induce with a short-acting agent, typically methotrexate or propofol.
Okay.
But the critical step is administering succinylcholine to induce neuromuscular blockade. You want to prevent the seizure's motor activity from physically snapping the patient's long bones or vertebrae.
Oh, wow. So you paralyze the muscles, but the brain still has the seizure.
Exactly. The brain still reaps the therapeutic benefit. And then, to manage the sympathetic surge, we rely on esmolol.
Because it's a super fast-acting beta blocker.
Right. It perfectly counteracts that massive tachycardia and hypertension, preventing myocardial ischemia without lingering in the patient's system all day.
That is fascinating. Before we leave mood disorders, we have to talk about bipolar disorder and lithium. Lithium is the gold standard for mania. But it's not some complex molecule, it's just a simple elemental ion.
Yeah, just an ion.
How does that interfere with our anesthesia plans?
Well, lithium sits right next to sodium on the periodic table, so it casually substitutes for sodium and potassium in cellular ion channels.
Thank you.
Very. And by altering that ion transport, lithium significantly decreases the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. So when you give depolarizing or non-depolarizing muscle relaxants, their effects are profoundly prolonged. There's just less endogenous acetylcholine to compete with them.
Which means if you don't monitor them closely, your patient stays paralyzed way longer than you expect.
Exactly. You have to be meticulous.
Okay. So moving from serotonin and norepinephrine, let's shift to another crucial neurotransmitter, dopamine, which puts us squarely in schizophrenia.
Right. Schizophrenia's pathophysiology, especially the positive symptoms like hallucinations, is driven by excessive dopamine activity.
In the mesolimbic pathway, right?
Exactly. And the negative symptoms, like a flattened affect, are also tied into this network. So the treatment relies on administering antipsychotics that block D2 dopamine receptors.
But, I mean, if we block dopamine to fix the psychosis, aren't we risking movement disorders? Like, I don't know, turning down the volume on the radio, but accidentally turning off the headlights.
That is a perfect analogy, because the brain isn't neatly compartmentalized. By quieting the hallucinations in one pathway, you're inadvertently starving the nigrostriatal pathway of dopamine.
And that controls smooth movement.
Right, so that explains the severe extrapyramidal side effects we see. Things like acute dystonia and tardive dyskinesia are direct results of that dopamine blockade.
And it also sets the stage for a really scary emergency, right? Neuroleptic malignant syndrome, or NMS.
Yeah, NMS is a rare but fatal complication of extreme dopamine depletion. It essentially destroys the body's thermoregulatory center in the hypothalamus,
Leading to severe hyperthermia.
Yes, and when you profoundly block dopamine in the basal ganglia, you get this defining characteristic of NMS lead pipe muscle rigidity, along with stupor.
But wait, how do you differentiate NMS from serotonin syndrome or malignant hyperthermia? I mean, they all cause hyperthermia.
They do, and we use the chapter's drug-induced hyperthermic syndromes table to differentiate them. The timeline is key. Malignant hyperthermia triggers within minutes of exposure to anesthetic gases. Serotonin syndrome peaks within 12 hours.
Okay.
But NMS is much slower. It takes 24 to 72 hours of dopamine blockade to fully develop. And while serotonin syndrome has clonus and hyperreflexia, NMS has that unyielding lead pipe rigidity.
How do you treat it?
You use bromocriptine to try and restore dopamine receptor agonism or dantrolene to directly relax the skeletal muscle.
Got it. Okay, now, not all psychiatric conditions are strictly driven by neurotransmitter excesses. Let's talk about things that manifest through profound physiological starvation or autonomic overdrive.
Right, like anxiety disorders. With generalized anxiety disorder or situational anxiety like stage fright, you get this massive sympathetic overdrive.
And what's interesting is that using beta blockers for performance anxiety doesn't actually sedate the patient's mind, right?
No, it doesn't. The beta blockers just occupy the peripheral receptors, physically blocking the motor and autonomic symptoms, the trembling, the racing heart.
It just stops the physical feedback loop.
Exactly. But eating disorders present a totally different physiological nightmare.
Right. Anorexia and bulimia.
With these conditions, the patient's system is chronically starved. You are navigating massive electrolyte abnormalities like hypokalemia and severe hypovolemia.
Which makes the heart incredibly irritable.
Yes, the risk for cardiac dysrhythmias is huge. But critically, the physical starvation also causes severe delayed gastric emptying.
So even if they fasted, their stomach might still be full.
Exactly. They are a massive aspiration risk. You have to evaluate for that and typically use a rapid sequence induction to secure the airway immediately.
Okay, so having covered psychiatric conditions, we naturally have to transition to substance use disorders. These occur in about 11% of hospitalized patients, right?
Yes, and they very frequently co-occur with mental illness.
And there are specific screening tools for this.
Right. The chapter details tools like the SESQ-ALK and SESQ drug questionnaires, and it walks through the modern criteria.
Things like impaired control, social impairment, risky use, physiologic changes.
Exactly. And diagnosing mild, moderate, or severe SUD just depends on how many of those 11 criteria the patient meets, which raises an important question.
What's that?
What is the actual difference between addiction, physical dependence, and tolerance?
Oh, that's a great point, because people mix those up all the time.
They do. Tolerance and physical dependence are just expected physiological responses. The receptors adapt to a chronic chemical presence.
Right. You need more of the drug to get the same effect, or you feel sick if you stop taking it.
Exactly. But addiction involves the compulsive pursuit and use of a substance despite severe psychosocial or physical harm. It's a behavioral pathology.
So, practically speaking, how do we objectively know what's in a patient's system before surgery?
We use urine drug testing. But there's presumptive testing, which is your rapid point-of-care screen, and then definitive testing, like gas chromatography.
And the timeline matters there.
Hugely. Cocaine, for example, can stay in the urine for up to 3 days.
Even though its anesthetic effects only last a few hours.
Right. So a positive urine screen tells you about recent exposure, but it doesn't mean they are acutely intoxicated on the table.
Okay, let's apply these principles to specific substances, starting with alcohol.
Alcohol is a profound central nervous system depressant. In acute intoxication, they lack a gag reflex.
So huge aspiration risk. You need to protect the airway.
Absolutely. But chronic use is different. The brain downregulates the inhibitory GABA receptors and massively upregulates the excitatory NMDA receptors to compensate.
And when they stop drinking, those breaks are gone.
Right, and you get withdrawal. The timeline is super predictable. Tremors at 6 to 8 hours, seizures between 8 and 24 hours, and delirium tremens, or DTs, at 2 to 4 days.
We use the CIWA-R scale to measure that, right?
Yes, and we treat it with benzodiazepines to essentially replace the alcohol at the GABA receptor.
Okay, so here's a question. If a patient is on a medication to stop drinking, like disulfiram, how does that mess with our anesthesia plan?
This is a crucial intraoperative connection. Disulfiram makes you sick if you drink, but it also inhibits an enzyme called dopamine beta hydroxylase.
Which means they can't make norepinephrine properly.
Exactly. Their stores are depleted, so if the patient's blood pressure crashes in the OR and you try to use an indirect vasopressor like ephedrine, it won't work well. You need a direct acting agent like phenylephrine.
Because there's no endogenous norepinephrine to squeeze out of the nerve terminal.
Right. Now, cocaine operates a bit differently, but causes immense cardiovascular risk.
Right. Myocardial ischemia, coronary vasospasm, ventricular dysrhythmias.
It's a massive sympathetic storm. The golden rule for acute cocaine intoxication in the OR is absolutely avoid sympathetic nervous system stimulation.
No ketamine.
No ketamine. Deepen the anesthesia before intubation, and always have nitroglycerin ready to combat coronary spasm.
Okay, so while alcohol and cocaine are these massive cardiovascular challenges, the modern opioid epidemic has fundamentally rewritten how an anesthesiologist manages pain.
It really has. We're dealing with a rise in highly potent synthetic opioids like fentanyl.
And an overdose presents with a slow respiratory rate, increased tidal volume, and miotic pinpoint pupils.
Yeah, exactly. And the treatment of opioid use disorder, or OUD, relies on 3 FDA-approved medications outlined in the text: buprenorphine, methadone, and naltrexone.
Okay, let's talk about buprenorphine. So if buprenorphine is a partial agonist with an incredibly strong grip on the receptor, is giving a regular opioid painkiller like trying to play musical chairs, where the buprenorphine simply refuses to give up its seat.
That is a brilliant analogy. Yes, it refuses to give up its seat. Its binding affinity is incredibly high.
So what do we do? Because the old rule was to stop buprenorphine before surgery, right?
That was the old rule, but the modern protocol is strictly the opposite. Do not discontinue buprenorphine or methadone in the perioperative setting.
Wait, really? Why not?
Because discontinuing it worsens outcomes drastically. It throws them into withdrawal and increases the risk of relapse. Instead, anesthesiologists must anticipate a 20 to 30% increase in acute opioid requirements due to tolerance.
Wow, so you just have to give way more medication.
Yes, you must use high-affinity full agonists like fentanyl or hydromorphone to actively compete for those receptors. And you must use a multimodal approach.
Meaning ketamine, NSAIDs, regional anesthesia.
Exactly. Attack the pain from multiple pathways.
So what does this all mean for the patient waking up from surgery?
It means we have to understand that their maintenance OUD medications provide baseline tolerance, not surgical pain relief. Aggressive, multimodal post-op pain management is absolutely required.
Okay, let's look at a couple of other recreational substances. Amphetamines.
Right. Chronic amphetamine use depletes central nervous system catecholamines.
Okay, so if their blood pressure drops during surgery and you try to use a drug that squeezes out their natural adrenaline, it's like trying to squeeze water from a bone-dry sponge.
Exactly like the disulfiram situation. Direct-acting vasopressors like epinephrine or phenylephrine are strictly required for refractory hypotension here.
Got it. What about cannabis?
The physiological effects include an increased resting heart rate, orthostatic hypotension, and airway irritation. But the key anesthesia implication is that THC can actually prolong barbiturate sleep times.
Good to know. Okay, we've looked at how substance use affects patients, but we urgently need to turn the mirror on the anesthesiology profession itself before we wrap up.
Yes, the occupational hazard of addiction.
The statistics in the chapter are pretty startling. Anesthesiologists make up 5.5% of physicians overall, but they are highly overrepresented in addiction programs.
Specifically, historically making up 12 to 15% of physicians in those programs. And their primary drugs of choice are highly potent opioids like fentanyl and sufentanil.
Why? Is it just the sheer proximity to the drugs?
Proximity is a huge factor. There's easy access, the drugs have high addictive potential, and diversion is relatively simple.
Like falsifying records or keeping leftover drugs.
Exactly. Add to that a highly stressful environment and a control-oriented personality type that's drawn to the field.
What are the signs someone might be diverting?
Volunteering for extra cases, working alone constantly or noticeably, patients waking up in disproportionate pain because their charted drugs were actually diverted.
Wow. So if you see that, what do you do?
The absolute rule of intervention is this: never confront the person one-on-one.
Because of the suicide risk.
Yes, the suicide risk is incredibly high. You must use a formal multidisciplinary physician assistance committee to intervene safely.
That's incredibly sobering. Okay, as a final clinical tool, let's look at general toxicology, specifically acetaminophen overdose.
It's the most common medicinal overdose. The danger is a toxic metabolite called NAPQI.
And we use the Rumack-Matthew nomogram for this, right?
Yes, figure 29.4 in the chapter. It plots plasma concentration against hours after ingestion.
To stratify the risk of hepatic toxicity.
Exactly. Unlikely, possible, or probable toxicity. And it dictates when to administer the antidote and acetylcysteine.
Which is super effective, right?
Virtually 100% effective if given within 8 hours. It replenishes glutathione so the liver can neutralize the NAPQI.
That is amazing. You know, we spend so much time learning how drugs act on the body.
Right.
But this chapter shows us that the patient's underlying mind, their mood, their habits, their struggles, literally rewires their neurochemistry. As a clinician, you aren't just anesthetizing a generic human body. You are navigating the unique, lived chemical history of that specific brain.
It really leaves you with a thought to mull over. If underlying substance use and mood disorders rewire these fragile receptors, what happens when we introduce the profound chemical suppression of anesthesia? Do our anesthetics leave their own subtle, long-term epigenetic footprint on those same neurochemical pathways?
Wow. Yeah, that really makes you look at the syringe differently. Well, on behalf of everyone here, a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team. See you next time.